if you look at a graph of the increase in malocclusion, it kind of slowly increased after the Neolithic Revolution, but it just took off after the Industrial Revolution and skyrocketed even more after the 1960s. And Mike Mead talks about this. It's the most I think it's because the most important factor in it is the lack of breastfeeding. Women's left in the 1960s. Women were liberated. They left the workplace, right, and they stopped breastfeeding as much. And if that's the most important part of this, I think, because
I agree.
Like John Mew was talking about it. He says, yeah, if you give rats soft foods, it does give them malocclusion. It does increase their malocclusion, but the most your skull is most malleable when you're a child. Your sutures are most open, and that's when you subconsciously habituate mewing, and it's just, I think that's the reason. I think people need to breastfeed more. People need to, obviously you can, if you have someone that's under the age of 8 and they weren't breastfed, if you teach them proper tongue posture, that's going to do a world of difference for them. Mm-hmm. But the most important thing you can do for a kid is breastfeed them. And they were breastfeeding their children for up to 3 to 5 years. And now people don't even do it for 5 months, if at all,
Yeah, if at all. I couldn't agree more with you. I'm a huge advocate of maximizing the time of breastfeeding. I think minimum 2 years. I think the more the better. Yeah, I know Michael Jordan was breastfed till he was 3. I know that in Mongolia and in a lot of Muslim cultures where breastfeeding is considered a right of the child, they'll go up until age 5 or 6. Traditions. For sure. Because if you just think about it from, an evolutionary biology point of view, first things first, right? As soon as the baby comes out, well, what do we start with? What's the only real environmental factor that's in your control for the first year or two? It's just breastfeeding, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing. That's the way a baby can mew. How do you get a baby to press his tongue up onto the roof of his mouth? Get him to suckle his mother's nipple. Because when the baby reaches out and clasps the nipple, it trains the tongue to go up and forward, as compared to a bottle, which is longer and allows the baby to habituate having his tongue rest on the floor of his mouth. The milk just falls in. He doesn't even have to work for it. Mm-hmm. And then when he's resting, when he's not suckling, if he's been breastfeeding, the tongue will just naturally go up and forward and serve as the natural palate expander.
Yeah. And, this really started kicking off in the 1960s when, women started, they stopped being homemakers, there was a huge cultural shift,
and breastfeeding started being seen as oppressive, or somehow it's representative of women being subservient, and so the baby sort of got thrown out with the bathwater, where something that was in fact good got associated with something that may be negative, which is women not having the liberty that they wanted, and so they stopped breastfeeding, not realizing that there would be huge negative effect on the baby that came from that.
Yeah. Okay, so this was an article about kind of to your point of how breastfeeding is seen as oppressive. I think this is really horrible. I'm not sure if the author of this was intentionally malicious when she wrote it, but her actions are certainly malicious whether she means it or not, because she's going to discourage people from breastfeeding, as you'll see. So she says, the many, many costs of breastfeeding. Breastfeeding isn't free, and it isn't a solution to the national baby formula shortage. So this was written during the baby formula shortage, which I don't know if you heard about. But she was basically saying, breastfeeding, women shouldn't be forced to do it. So she says, data shows that mothers who breastfeed for 6 months or more experience longer and more severe income loss than mothers who formula feed. She shows a graph of income loss. And sure, they lose income, but are women meant to be workhorses? It's literally the most important job that you can do, raising the next generation of people. And it's not even just the mechanical aspect of it. It's the warmth. A baby receives no other satisfaction than breastfeeding and other human contact. Sure, you can give them other contact by holding them, but that's the only they can't. I'm sure they can't testify to it because they're children. But that's that's the only satisfaction they receive. Also, like, what's interesting, he was this World War II veteran named George Lincoln Rockwell. He wrote a book, This Time the World. Maybe someone would be interested in reading this. Maybe people that listen to this would be interested in reading this. And he talks about how his mother they were really pushing bottles on, they were trying to bind up his wife's breast, he said, and give her pills that would dry up her breasts. This is what he said. I got my first lesson in the attitude of modern society and hospitals toward breastfeeding at the Bronxville Hospital, where Bonnie was born. The pressure on mothers to bind up their breasts, take pills, and do anything else to dry up the miraculous fountain of God-given life itself was terrific. It is little wonder to me that many of our children today are insecure, as the Freudians call it, when they have been denied the direct, warm animal contact with their mothers in their most helpless state. Babies can't testify to their sensations, of course, nor can they remember them, but I am sure that if they could, a bottle-fed baby would feel just like a man whose wife handed him some kind of rubber mannequin to sleep with. Such a device could be manufactured to equal and perhaps exceed the mechanical performance of a human wife. But the mechanical stimulation is not all that is necessary. It is the indefinable warmth and love of the person which is the priceless ingredient. And how much more it must be so with a tiny helpless thing which has no other satisfaction at all. A baby lives entirely for contact and sustenance from its mother. When she purposefully and willfully denies it that warm contact and palms off a glass bottle full of milk meant for a cow mother's baby, no matter how scientifically it is mixed, she is starving that baby of the basic element of life, love, at the very time it should be filled and stuffed with overflowing with warmth and love. If the mother is unable to feed her child, no matter how hard she tries, then, of course, the bottle is the only solution. But it should be the last resort, and relatively rare, instead of the present norm in so many cases. The whole thing is another manifestation of the corrosive and perverted idea of moderns, that it is somehow degrading to be a woman, to have babies, to nurse them, and to fulfill the animal functions of a woman. For my children's sake, I am happy to say I was able to prevail over my mother's dictum with Judy, and she lovingly nursed all the kids. So, I mean, like, you can see how, like, this sort of started kicking off in the 1960s with, women's liberation.
Yeah, that's extraordinarily upsetting, man. Like, to think about how bizarrely unnatural it really is to deprive a baby of that.
Mm-hmm.
And
that paired with circumcision, I mean, that's going to have profound, and pornography, internet, people are walking around just, like, totally different than they could be, totally robbed of their potential, Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. And these things are happening to children before they're at an age where they're able to advocate for themselves.
Yeah.
It really does explain a lot about the way things have become in terms of the mental health, especially of the Zoomer generation, but even millennials and even boomers, because boomers were the first to not be breastfed en masse.
Mm-hmm. Now we're running out of time here, but I wanted to go through like this article about breastfeeding.
Sure.
So, but the persistent myth that breastfeeding is free overlooks the real costs associated with breastfeeding, and like the article is really making it out that breastfeeding is this oppressive thing that's horrible
so are
for women.
Those are piggy banks?
Those are piggy banks on her boobs. They're saying like you're wasting time breastfeeding, and like women should be working instead of breastfeeding.
So the argument is that breastfeeding is costing women money.
Yeah.
So the very simple response to that is, well, now you're going to have to pay orthodontic fees and other medical fees, and you're going to have to spend all this money compensating for your child's lack of natural health.
Yeah.
You're going to have to spend money compensating on your child's lack of mental health. You're going to have to spend money on special athletic trainers because your child is not going to be athletic because he's going to have a poor airway. Like that, the 1 or 2 years you could spend breastfeeding, I think, are a fantastic financial investment because you're just saving so much money coming down the pike in terms of expenses dealing with. Yeah. And I've seen it, man. Like when a kid isn't breastfed and he becomes a mouth breather, that's when babies start getting ear infections and stuff. Like as soon as they stop being breastfed, they start becoming a mouth breather. Now they start getting ear infections. Now the mother's got to take time out of work to take the kid to the hospital, and she's losing out on money in that regard. Like financially, it's not even close. The way better investment is to take a couple years to just breastfeed.
Yeah, and it's good for the mother too. I mean, it's like the most natural thing you can do. You're connecting with your baby. But also IQ and good looks are probably the most important factors in success in life. And if you're sleep deprived as a child, according to Dr. David Gorzal, you can lose up to 10 to 20 IQ points. And each IQ point is associated with a loss of $170,000 over your lifetime. So basically these kids are losing out of millions of dollars of potential earnings. And just think about this on a society-wide level, the effects if like all of this was corrected, how much more productive everyone in society would be. We would just have such a well-working society. Everyone would be happier and work together. People would be coming up with so many more ideas.